The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how to analyze data sets with pivot tables. We will start with creating a pivot table. In this video, we will pick up where we left off with the tables video. Let's go ahead and start by creating a pivot table. Now that we've already created the table in the first video, let's go ahead and with that table, let's go ahead and click on the Insert tab and click on Pivot Table. Notice that Microsoft Excel recognizes a table and it's simply going to take that table and use the information on the table to create the pivot table. Let's go ahead and click OK. Notice here that we have the beginnings of our pivot table. Our pivot table is going to organize the information by fields of data. Each one of the columns from our table now becomes a field. In this case, we're going to be able to organize the data in our pivot tables by filters, by columns, by rows, and by values. In general, we're not going to use the columns field very often. You may want to reference this part of the chapter that describes the four areas of a pivot table. Let's go ahead and start by dragging the branding name down into the filters. Let's grab the fund name and drag that into the rows. Let's drag the ticker down into the rows. And then finally, let's drag the 2013 return, or the return 2013, into the values. Now notice how quickly that we've set up or at least started creating our pivot table. However, if you would think about a spreadsheet that was organized by fund name, ticker, and the 2013 value, this probably isn't what you would think of. So notice that a pivot table has at least two tabs associated with it. Let's go ahead and click on the Design tab, click on Report Layout, and click on Show in Tabular Form. Okay, this looks a little bit more like what you would expect based on the fields that we created. But notice here, after each individual item, it's giving us the subtotal of that item. And pivot tables automatically set up with subtotals. In this case, in this table, we don't want a subtotal. So in the subtotals, let's go ahead and click on subtotals and then do not show subtotals. And there we have it. Notice that the ease of which we were able to create this table and modify it for our purposes. Now, because an ETF or a mutual fund is generally rated as a return or percentage rate of return for a given year, let's go ahead and change this to a percentage. Let's go ahead and right click anywhere in column C, click on number format, and go ahead and click on percentage to 2 decimal points and click OK. Not that it makes a difference right now, but it will later. So let's make another quick change. Right click once again anywhere in column C and go ahead and click on Summarize Values By, and let's click on Average. Okay, so this is the average rate of return for each item on our each item for the 2013 rate of return. Now let's do a quick modification to our table. Let's call this column here the 2013 or the 2013 return. And notice here that maybe we want this centered. So if we wanted to, we could go back and center this. And the spreadsheet itself still works like any other spreadsheet. So I could go up here to column C and double click to auto size and shrink that column down. Okay, so now once again, gosh, we still have 700 and some items within the table. Maybe we want to narrow this down. So one way to do that is, like a table, we're automatically set up with our drop down arrows. So let's go ahead and click on the drop down arrow next to fund name. Let's go ahead and click on Value Filters and click on Top 10, and notice that we want the 2013 return over here and click OK. So now rather than having 764 ETFs to sort through, we've very quickly narrowed it down to the top 10 with that quick filter. But now let's say that we want to refine this even a little bit more, and we want this in numeric order. So once again, let's click on the drop down arrow next to fund name, click on More Sort Options. Let's click on this in descending order by 2013 return and click OK. And so now we went ahead and sorted that by the 2013 return and in that order, or in the appropriate order. Now in this case, let's say that just out of curiosity we see what the top 10 happens to be. What if we wanted to see the bottom 10? Well, very quickly, if we click on the drop down arrow, click on the Value Filters, the top 10 once again, but rather than the top 10, let's go ahead and click on the bottom 10 and click OK. So we went very quickly from the top 10 to the bottom 10 performing ETFs for the year of 2013. It's not the kind of list that any ETF manager would want to be on. Now, one of the things to note about pivot tables is that if we wanted to copy this data to another worksheet, we could do that very easily. If we simply copied all of the information that we have here, right click, click on Copy, go down here and click on Insert a New Worksheet, right click, and simply paste. Notice that I pasted the entire pivot table onto a new worksheet. So now I have two pivot tables going. One of the things to note is that pivot tables create very large files, and so if you're ever working with pivot tables, you want to be careful with how many pivot tables you have within a single worksheet or workbook. In addition to that, you might also consider recipient of the information, because you might not want somebody messing with that information, or you might not want them to have access to all of that information, so you might not want to give them the entire pivot table. So because of that, I'm going to click Undo, and rather than copying everything, I'm just going to copy the results of the pivot table and click on Copy, right click, Copy, go back to the new worksheet, right click and say Paste. And there, notice that I've created a replica of the information that I sorted through without replicating the pivot table and creating another pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and delete that worksheet because I really don't need it. I'm going to go back to sheet 1, which has my pivot table. Okay, let's continue working with our pivot table. Let's go down to the rows and drag the fund name out of the rows and the ticker out of the rows. And let's then grab the branding name and drag that down into the rows. Okay, now we have a whole new worksheet going here. Now within the branding name, let's go ahead and click on the drop down arrow. Click on More Sort Options. Click on Descending A to Z and 2013 Return and click OK. And there we have our family fund sorted by rate of return for the year of 2013. Let's say we want to do a little more investigation here, however, and let's go ahead then and grab the ticker and drag that down into the values section. So now we can see how many funds, or not funds, how many ETFs each one of these different fund families manages. We can very quickly see that iShares by far and away as of 2013 had more ETFs under management than any other family of funds or family of ETFs. In addition, we can see that Fidelity, even though they had the best rate of return for 2013, they only had one ETF under management. So that may not be very comparable to iShares. Now let's continue on. Let's drag a copy of the ticker once again, but let's drag that into the rows area. And now notice that we have the family of fund, we have the ticker or the individual ETF, and of course a count of 1 for each one. Okay, let's go down to our count of ticker, and down in the values area, let's go ahead and pull that out of our table. Now, one of the things to note here about pivot tables is that pivot tables will automatically create the outlining feature for us here. So in this case, if within the branding name area, if we wanted to, we could right click on expand and collapse, and click on collapse entire field. And so notice then we're back to just the family of funds and the average. That's why we changed it from the sum to the average earlier, the average rate of return for each individual family. You could individually click on these to expand or contract, or we can right click and expand the entire field. Or in this case, let's leave it as it being collapse the entire field. So it's simply right click, expand, collapse, collapse entire field. Now let's say that we are interested in finding the fund families that have at least 30 or more ETFs under management. Let's go ahead and grab ticker one more time, drag it back into the values. Now in the drop down area next to branding name, go ahead and click the drop down area, click on value filters, click on greater than, and 2013, let's change that to count of ticker, and click on 30 or type in 30 and click OK. Now we have only the family of funds or family of ETFs that show greater than 30 ETFs under management. If we wanted to further refine our data, we could somewhere in column D right click on show values as, and click on percentage of grand total. So now rather than having the actual number of ETFs under management, we have the percentage of ETFs under management as a percentage of the grand total of ETFs for funds of greater than 30 ETFs. So once again, it's important to, if we were going to copy this off and give it to somebody else at this point, it would be very important for us to identify exactly what information is contained within the little table we just created. Okay, if we were so inclined, if we wanted to do an additional sort on this in numerical order from largest to smallest, we could go into the branding name, click on the drop down arrow, click on more sort options, click on descending order for count of ticker, and click OK. And there we have our sort of that information. And then continuing on, if we wanted, we could expand or collapse these. We could right click on expand entire field, and it's going to show each of the ETFs for each family or within each family of ETFs. Okay, let's go ahead and reset some of our data here. In the 2013 return, let's go ahead, right click and show values as, make sure that there's no calculations there in this column, and in the values area down here, let's go ahead and grab the ticker and pull it out of our table so it's no longer part of our table. Now, if you remember when we were working with tables, if we wanted to insert a column within the table and perform a calculation, you could simply right-click on any column, right-click, and click Insert. Well, notice in this case, Excel is not going to let us do that because these tables are uniquely tied to the data fields that we have within our table. So because of that, if we want to insert a calculated field or do a calculation within the pivot table itself, we need to insert a calculated field. So the way to do that is that if we click on the Analyze tab, notice here within the calculations, I have the fields and items set. I'm going to click on the calculated field, and let's call this calculated field the relative to cat. And the formula for our relative to cat is going to be, I'm going to click back up here, and then I'm going to don't click into the formula box, but down here click on Return 2013 Insert Field, and here comes the calculation minus the cat 2013 return, insert field, and click OK. Oh, and it looks like because I clicked in and out of that box, mine didn't work. So I'm going to get rid of that 0, and so I just have the equal sign and click OK. And here I have my calculated total now as part of my pivot table. Okay, continuing on, I want to make sure that click inside column D somewhere, right click. Oh, and then it's not going to let me summarize values by. Let's see if it's different for the 2013. Right click, summarize value by. It's on average as it should be. Okay, and it's not going to let me summarize my values by average for the relative to category. Okay, so let's say that rather than having the branding name here, let's go ahead and drag that out, and let's replace that by the funding name. And I'm going to grab the fund name and drag that down into the rows. And so there I have the fund name. Notice that it remembered the filter that I had on it, so I'm going to click on that and go ahead and say clear the filter on the fund name. So now I have the fund name, the ticker symbol, the 2013 rate of return, and the rate of return for the category of funds each one of these belongs to compared to the 2013. And so this relative to cat, once again, is a holdover from, we calculated that in the tables video. Now notice here that in this column I have some negatives and some positives. So let's say that I'm interested in only the ones that happen to have a positive or that only exceeded, the 2013 exceeded the category rate of return for that year, thus reflecting superior performance. So let me click on the drop down next to the fund name and click on the values filter, click on greater than 2013 return, and let's click on the relative to cat and then type 0 and click OK. So what that did was it eliminated any fund or ETF that happened to have a rate of return of greater than or of less than 0 for the relative to category field. And then finally, perhaps maybe I would like to, rather than sorting by the 2013 return, I would be interested in sorting by the relative to category. So let's go ahead on the drop down arrow, click on more sort options, descending, but now let's click on the sum of relative to category and click OK. And now we have it sorted on this field rather than the 2013 rate of return. Okay, that concludes the introduction to pivot tables, and we will continue on with the next video on using pivot tables for financial statements.